every month I get sent these little packages from India, from my friends, priests in this one's from the Shiva temple, and this one's from the goddess temple in Kanchipuram. This is a little bag of ash that is offered to Shiva in the temple. So why is Mr. Shivacharya or Mr. Shastri every month sending me these little packages? Because well, he's a friend, and he wants to send me something that will be good for me. This ash has been offered to Shiva. It's part of the ritual of worshipping the Murti of Shiva. Ash is smeared onto it. Then the ash becomes sacred ash, and Mr. Shivacharya sends me this ash so that I can touch a little bit onto my body, and by the touch of that ash I will become purified. He's doing it as a favour to me. Same with the red powder that is offered to the goddess in the temple of Kamakshi Amman in Kanchipuram. This powder has touched the goddess, and therefore it has a sanctifying potency. I remember I asked, there was a lady brought me back. She went up to Mount Kailash and Manasa Sarovar, the sacred lake in the Himalayas, and she brought me a little jam jar back down filled with sacred water. And I had a very interesting discussion we asked there. I said, what about if Mrs. Patel had forgotten to fill me up a jam jar and felt guilty and got to the airport and filled it up then? Would it matter? If I believed it to be sacred, would it still purify me, or is it inherently sacred because it's come from that sacred? And again, opinions were divided, and that goes back to the same division. Is the Murti symbolically God? Is it subjectively a deity, or is it objectively God? And opinions are divided on that, but the traditional view has been that the Murti is itself an embodiment of the deity. The deity has, out of his or her grace, appeared in that form in order to sanctify us, to receive our worship and be an object for our sentiments of devotion to it. Okay, and let's not overlook, finally, moving on, again, it seems remarkable that another major field of Hindu religious practice relates to inward contemplation. Now, in future sessions we will look in more detail at the yoga system, and we haven't got time to dwell too long on it at this point. But I think, again, I want to make that point about practice being related to belief systems. So the worship of the Murti, the sanctity of the powders, etc., is down to a belief in the external presence of a divinity. God is there, the creator, controller of the world, a monotheistic vision which demands our worship of them. Now, from the perspective of other Hindus who believe not in the external deity of a supreme being, but in the internal divinity of one's own self, the Atman as Brahman, then worship appears less appropriate. Rather, knowledge is the key. Knowledge of oneself, and knowledge, therefore, because the self is the absolute, knowledge of the self is knowledge of the absolute. Knowledge, jnana, is the key to spiritual progression, the key to moksha, liberation from rebirth. On the basis of this belief system, the religious practice develops as a form of inner exploration. We see references to this in the Upanishads, in the Katha, especially in the Shvetashvatara. The idea that one undergoes a form of self-discipline, control of the mind, and then turning of the mind inwards to perceive the different layers and levels of consciousness, and ultimately to go beyond mundane consciousness and find the spark of the divine, which is the absolute divine within our own being. So the whole of the Patanjali yoga system is devised to come to that goal. First of all, the mind has to be controlled. The external perceptions have to be stilled so that you're not constantly distracted by all the things that are going on around you. And then the controlled mind can be placed and kept exactly where you want it. I'm sure everybody could try this and try and think about one thing for a minute. Immediately you find your mind zooms off. It's out of control. It's got a mind of its own. It just goes where it wants to go. But yoga practice initially is to control the mind so it goes not where it wanders, but where you want it to go, and it stays there. So, for example, you might meditate on a mantra and you think for half an hour of nothing but that one word. Incredibly difficult to do. I'm not saying Not claiming to have done it, but that's the system, that you can put your mind on one single point and it won't go anymore. When your mind is controlled in that way, instead of projecting outwards via the senses become still and the mind turns backwards and looks at that which is prior to itself. First of all, the intellect, then the sense of ego, and finally penetrating beyond all the subtle forms of consciousness to find the spiritual element that lies in Hindu teaching at the heart of our own being. So the religious practice there, the yoga system, which I've not at all done justice to, but trying to summarise, is based on that notion that God is not a being out there looking down upon us like the big eye in the sky, but he is the very essence of our own being. Therefore, that form of religious practice, which is equally a part of Hinduism, although not so much practice as worship, is similarly based on a specific Hindu belief system. And I think that's the point I want to say. We will, over the coming weeks, encounter all manner of Hindu religious practices, but in every case we can trace them back to a particular belief in a merciful God, belief in the presence of sanctity in this world, belief in inner divinity, and all these different array of beliefs that we will encounter have a concomitant set of religious practices that reflect those beliefs and enable us to achieve the goals that are prescribed by those belief systems. Okay, thank you very much.